Welcome back to the panel discussion, Building the Hybrid Cloud, sponsored by Red Hat here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Gerard Shelak. He's Director of the Technical Services Division in the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies at the GSA. Eric Simon, he's the Systems Expert in the Cloud Computing Program at NIST. And Gunnar Hellickson, Chief Strategist in Red Hat's USA Federal Public Sector Division. And I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And so let's talk about governance, because this comes up a lot in cloud. I think ever since computing kind of slithered out of the data center, the question of governance has been a question for CIOs, technical staffs, and the users and the program managers in the government. So Eric, again, with NIST having been the author of all the guidance that the federal government has around cloud, what is a good governance model? Because that ultimately affects the way the technology is deployed.
Well, I think the key to governance in the cloud is that you've made things much more complex, and it's shared responsibility. So where you implement your own data center, you're fully responsible from the top down to the bottom for the governance of that system. When you go to the cloud, you're sharing that responsibility. And we talk about conservation of responsibility. So again, as you change cloud service models and you go from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service to software as a service, then your responsibilities change. But ultimately, you still have to ensure that over the entire system, you have the governance in place that provides the assurances that you need. Now, when we talk about hybrid clouds, you've added a third or a fourth or fifth aspect in there, entities that need to be on board and understand what their responsibilities are, how the responsibilities are shared across the different providers. So it gets to be very complex. And it's a challenge and something that we need to continually work on.
Yeah, because in the client-server era or the mainframe terminal era, you had systems analysts that worried about kind of the middle of the whole thing. And then you had an applications group that was always developing the new screens, for the application and the owner of that. And then you had the MIS people, or I guess you call them data center people, whatever they used to be called, and they were responsible for the hardware and maybe the 3270 architecture and all that. Now it's not there. It's somewhere else. And so I imagine that's a challenge for who's really in charge.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you start talking about the dynamic aspects of hybrid clouds. So not only where you're just splitting statically the responsibilities and the loads between two clouds, but you're changing how those loads are distributed across different clouds in real time. It becomes a very difficult governance issue.
All right, so Gerard, at GSA, you mentioned that in your office, Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies, you've got pretty much a big dependence on cloud. So who's the belly button that gets pushed when something happens, and how do you decide that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things I would say about governance. One, to build on something that Eric mentioned, how you're sharing some of that responsibility with the service provider. That's where something like FedRAMP program really comes into play and gives you some assurance, because security is more than security. Security, controls look at operations and all aspects of running an environment. So FedRAMP gives you some assurity that layer is being managed well. The second thing about governance, I think, if you're sort of reliving our past in a lot of respects, where we had data center sprawl, we had VM sprawl, and now we're having cloud service provider sprawl, because it's very easy for people to engage a cloud service provider on a micro level or micro purchase level, or to have it bundled into some other acquisition for services. And so we're seeing, I guess in one respect, OSIT, which is a short name for my office, was somewhat of a rogue player. If you look at GSA overall, and being way out in front in innovating on this cloud technology. But now if you look across GSA, we see that there are a lot of other offices within GSA that are doing the same thing in sort of an unmanaged approach. But GSA has recognized that from the CIO's level, and we're looking to be able to put some governance in and have some control over how things are deployed in the cloud.
I was going to say you could have a program manager that has a really great idea, and he's got a federal credit card, and he could give somebody in IT I'll give you 10,000 computers worth of power for a week. See what you can do. That's the kind of thing you probably don't want happening.
Right, and that's and things like that might happen without having the right controls in place up front. Like the enterprise architecture board at GSA is taking on a more holistic approach to cloud and incorporating that into their planning.
And Gunnar, then getting to the idea of governance, looking across agencies, you mentioned earlier there's that single pane of glass, if you will, that shows somebody what's going on with cloud. Is that the type of thing that can be found in that type of management console? What's going on with respect to who's in charge and who might be getting the rogue cloud services coming in?
Yeah, so handling this kind of shadow IT problem, right? There's something, the number I think is like 15% of IT spend ends up, as you said, slithering out the door. I love that phrase. I'm going to steal it.
No charge.
But I find a useful way to think about this is thinking in terms of platforms and workloads, right? So platforms are set often at the agency level or at most at the program level. And then on top of those platforms, we build workloads. And it's the platforms, in fact, that we're outsourcing to public providers, right? So the Amazon provides a particular platform at a particular kind of layer on the stack. You have platform as a service providers like our own OpenShift or companies like Heroku would provide application development environments as a platform, and people build on top of those. FedRAMP is very useful in this respect because it allows us to take the responsibilities that belong to the platform provider, and we can kind of outsource those according to particular SLAs or contracts, and then that frees us up to do work on top. That arrangement it's much easier to think about things in terms of what's going to be a platform and what's going to be a workload, rather than trying to forklift this jumble of confusion around what's a platform and what's a workload and sticking it into somebody else's environment, right? So I think determining the line of demarcation is very important. And going back to your original question, which was the pane of glass, that's what the pane of glass can provide, is a way of managing the workloads, which can then be distributed onto any number of platforms that you like.
Okay, and Gerard, so let's go back to that issue of who's doing what and whether you're buying infrastructure as a service or software as a service. Let's take the example, I don't know, mobile device management is something that GSA is involved with and a lot of agencies are buying. And several of the big MDM suppliers have a cloud version, or you can host it yourself. So suppose you have a cloud version, then that's that vendor's cloud coming in. So how do you handle that, when maybe the data and everybody else's applications besides the MDM are, say, GSA operated, but on someone else's infrastructure? So you've got software as a service and infrastructure as a service in the same environment.
So I'm not seeing too much of that in my office. We're really more whole total solution in one environment. But I did want to make another point on the governance question. Sorry to bring you back to that, but I think that the flip side of governance, the flip side of governance that we need to keep in mind is, control is one side, but the other side that we don't ever want to overlook is innovation. And so, we need to be able to balance those two when we look at governance. We have 18F group now at GSA, which is highly innovative, fast moving, and need the responsiveness that you get when they have their own some control over what they're working on without having the layers of governance on top of that. So we need to be able to balance those two things out. And I think that's a key point and I think that the new tools that are coming out, like Red Hat's CloudForm, and I know that Dell just bought a similar product, and they're incorporating it there into their product suite. And I think that those tools, I think, will allow agencies to put those governance models in place, but still support the innovative side of it, which is, I think, key.
So innovation is your office's middle name. So how do you keep abreast of what's going on in the technology market? Because every week we've talked about like 10 new products nobody heard of a year ago that are out there now.
Spend weekends.
All right, and listen to Federal News Radio. We've always got that stuff on too. Good. And so, Eric, what about that? What's a good governance approach when you have different models, hybrid models, where you might have software as a service, or just infrastructure as a service, or you're hosting your own? and all three are going on at once.
NIST actually hasn't been doing a lot with governance. We've been trying to focus on some of the other problems in the decision-making tree that I described earlier. So there's a lot of people working on governance, but some of the real challenges with actually purchasing and using cloud services remain the ability to characterize services and get the service capabilities provided in a consistent, comparable manner. And as I mentioned earlier, the SLAs as well. Existing SLAs do not meet the needs of the customer, and they do not protect the provider very well either.
But that's a good place to go with SLAs. We talked about that earlier. What are the elements in an SLA that you should have to make sure that you can measure it and know what you're getting that supports what it is you're trying to do ultimately?
Well, I'm actually currently involved in some international standardization efforts. I lead a ISO IEC standards effort for developing an SLA concepts and terminology. So the idea is to provide not a structure for an SLA, but the building blocks that will be used to compose an SLA. So providing flexibility and yet providing a common language that will allow us to communicate. And it really ties back to the requirements. All your requirements need to be in your service agreements and your service level agreements. Some of the key ones related to the performance, such as the availability, the responsiveness, also things that we're putting in the SLA cover security requirements, how you manage data at the end of life, how you manage customer response and downtime as well.
And that idea of responsiveness, though, that's a tough one because often, I think Gerard mentioned this earlier, it's the design of your application and the way you optimize it that has a lot of effect on responsiveness, which may not really be totally under the control of the cloud provider.
Absolutely. And in addition, there's the network, which often is in between the users and the provider. And it has a large impact, but it's not the provider's responsibility. So you as a consumer need to know how the network impacts things, but you also need to know what the service provider is providing. And again, it comes down to responsibility. Your network provider needs to take responsibility for their responsiveness, and the provider needs to take responsibility for their responsiveness piece. And it's a case-by-case analysis of how that is split up and who's responsible for what.
And so, Gunnar, really I guess the goal of responsiveness for everybody in a perfect world is LAN-like response or your own computer-type response, even though the transactions are occurring over a wide area network. Is that a fair way to put it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it could be depending on the application, but I think there are a number of there's technical hurdles to that, right? You mentioned the network that's a very good example, right? And there's terminology and kind of the ontology. So being able to describe what your problem is and being able to part of responsiveness is actually bureaucratic responsiveness, right? There's famously when DISA tried to build their first cloud many years ago, the race cloud, they went out of their way to provide a credit card capabilities, right? So somebody could swipe their P card so they could quickly get a virtual machine. They went through a great deal of time and expense to build that in, and when they went live, they realized that it actually took, even though you could swipe a P card, it took 3 days to MIPR the money from one end of the DoD to the other. So it still took 3 days to stand up the machine, right? So even with the right standards in place, even with the right terminology in place, even if we can technically do it, there's still policy and process that is going to need to change in order to take advantage of some of the things that cloud can give us. Not the least of which, when we're talking about hybrid cloud, is arbitrage, right? Being able to compete one provider against another. If it takes me 4 months to move a workload from Amazon to an alternative provider, that doesn't give me all the flexibility that I should probably have, right? There's a lot of improvements to make there.
So the lesson is swipe your card on Friday morning, so you'll be there Monday morning.
That's right.
Your machine will be there waiting for you.
On Labor Day, yeah. Right.
But just I want to pick a little bit more at that responsiveness idea. Can the operator of the systems administrator, as it were, for the cloud application, can you see what's going on from your management console so that you know whether in general, the SLA is being met in terms of responsiveness?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I appreciate you bringing up the CloudForms application so often. But I think that that's an artifact, right? That's a symptom of work that you should be doing anyway, which is I'll go back to this idea of a platform, right? Standardizing portions of your infrastructure so that it can be effectively moved somewhere else. The stuff that can't be standardized, the stuff that's weird, the stuff that's kind of bespoke or one-off, that stuff is basically going to stay under your own purview. And so what a tool or our tool would allow you to do is model this stuff, capture it, just like a librarian would keep a card catalog of books. You want to keep a card catalog of capabilities so that you know what you have available and you know what you can compete amongst many different vendors. It's that basic work of modeling your environment and modeling your workloads, that's what the real benefit is. And the tool just makes that easier. Right?
And Gerard, a real quick question. Do you have any restrictions on users, say, in your environment so that, like in the middle of the day, they can't download a 50 megabyte file or something and louse everybody up?
We haven't set up any restrictions like that. I mean, we do try and anticipate load. A lot of our servers are supporting efforts that come out of OMB's office, and so sometimes there are lots of announcements that may generate a lot of traffic. So we try and anticipate that and use the elasticity features of the cloud so that we can beef up the capacity to support those things. But in terms of restricting general day-to-day use, no, we haven't had to do that.
All right, good. Well, I'm glad the users, they'll be glad to hear that, but let's hope they don't start downloading those 50 megabyte files knowing what you've just said. That brings us to a break. Our guests today are Gerard Shelak. He's Director of the Technical Services Division in the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technologies at the GSA. Gunnar Hellickson is Chief Strategist in Red Hat's U.S. Public Sector Group. And Eric Simmons, Systems Expert in the Electronic Information Group at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, on Building the Hybrid Cloud. Panel discussion sponsored by Red Hat here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.